Yeah.
Um, welcome, Christina Williams, to Language for Life, card number 52. Um, a further experiment into Cards for Life conversations and a deeper dive into them. And we were speaking recently about language, um, and your work that's emerging with language and with story, and your offering soon to emerge liminal stories. Um, and I think even in the title of that, we could maybe even talk about that a little bit. I suppose talking about that offering with you inspired this conversation of like, let's look a little bit at language because that's kind of the craft of story, I suppose, how we're putting story together. And I'm I'm always interested in how words, the language, shows up the the stories. And I think in some of our like preamble and chat, you were just kind of starting to speak to that. And I guess what we're used to, our environments inform the words that we choose, and then that speaks to the larger story. And I suppose it probably flows both ways. But this card, Language for Life, is an invitation to say, how can we shift our language to be more in harmony and in tune with living systems, with life? And there's some questions on the card, and an inspiration to think about, yeah, maybe we're not a thing, an object, but we're more a process. That's quite like a fundamental shift in language. But we could dive into any points on the card, and maybe we can come back to that. But yeah, what's interesting you with language? Would you like to say a little bit about liminal stories and about working with language?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the thing that I'm fascinated by at the moment with language is I think for me, it all started with realizing that we don't actually have the words to explain what is happening in the world, but also to us at this time. Um, and I think it started for me like several years ago with a personal experience, which I guess many would describe as like a spiritual experience, but I even find that word spiritual problematic because it assumes that it is something that cannot be explained, but like I can still perfectly explain to you what happened, just not with words that are normally used. So I
Right.
think that's kind of where my interest started. And then I got into this idea of, yeah, I started taking all these different courses and following all these different, paths and reading books and realizing like, oh, our stories, like everything is a story. I think Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari was actually the first one that really got me like, oh my gosh, money's a story. And that like blew my mind. And I was like, I
Wow.
never thought of this before. And now once you've seen it, it seems so obvious, right?
Can't unsee it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of where it all started for me. And that's how I started thinking about, okay, if everything is a story, then what are the new ones that we can tell that can help us to shift into a new way of doing things? And so there's like obviously the bigger systemic stories, but then I think for me, the fascination with language just comes in because that matters so much. Like, yes, telling a good, new, different story is super important, but we don't have the right words right now. We're so entrenched in these words of like climate change, which is like a very confusing word that's almost meaningless at this point, and like, you know, fossil fuels, like, okay, fuels from fossils. But like, again, like all of these words are just so, it doesn't explain the experience of what it is to be human. And I feel like that's the thing we're missing in order to move into a better relationship with our environment and with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah. And indigenous languages have some of those words, but we don't in any of our kind of Western languages that are quite dominant. We don't have those words. In English, especially so. English is like full of adjectives and we like don't have good nouns. Like we borrow nouns like Schadenfreude from German because we don't have one in English. You know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah. Yeah.
English is a particularly bad language when it comes to this, and it's such a dominant global language. So I find that quite interesting.
Right. And so that goes so much together with the dominant kind of reductionist, materialist paradigm and, the industrial revolution of Britain, sort of shaping and influencing the world so much. So I
Yeah.
see a lot of relationships there. But just to loop back to that, that's a really beautiful start. You alluding to like a personal experience, which um, you don't feel like it took a bit of language innovation, or it would do for you to describe that experience. And then I also heard you talking about saying like we don't have the words to explain what the world is going through right now. And I find that incredibly compelling um insight or observation. And like I also really like that you have a personal experience and you speak to a kind of a world experience, both of which are testing our ability to describe. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm just seeing that relationship, and I really like that. I'm so I think Cards for Life, talking to the inner and outer, is so much about wanting to support that multi-scale kind of thinking and connecting experience across scales. So it just feels nice to highlight that. Um,
Yeah, and I think there's something about like the connecting the inner and the outer is something that we can, if we tune in, we can feel it very well. But then it's quite hard to describe it afterwards
yeah,
because the words, we don't have the words. So,
someone
yeah.
said once, a thought dies in words, or is a quote to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and I think that that can be so true. And yet, when we can break through and describe something new, I guess that's maybe the place that we're sort of looking for. Um,
Yeah, and I think, I guess, sort of like to take it to another place here with the metaphors, like, which is part of what this card is about. I think that is actually a really helpful and crucial tool to explain things that we may not have a word for, or, oh, sorry.
Sorry. No worries.
We just got workers coming into our house, so that's great timing.
That's okay. This can just be a start. This could
Yeah,
just be
that's
the
fine.
first.
We can still work. I can still be on this call though, right?
Sorry.
Is it okay, Cass? Like, do they need to be in here?
Oh, they're working on the heating.
Oh, okay. All
Oof.
right. That was unexpected. I don't know.
No, no worries at all. And you know what? If we do cut this short, then I'm very happy to pick it up again because I feel
Yeah.
like this is a good start, and
Yeah,
I
no worries.
feel the need for some extra rest today. So even if we do, because I was kind of thinking like I could do with just yeah, just collapsing a little bit today, but I want to
Yeah.
keep this conversation as well. So I'm very happy if we do cut it short.
Yeah,
What
that's fine. We can also try another time. Yeah, I don't know what happened. They're coming to fix the heating. I think our heating's working, so I don't know what's going on. This is very unexpected. This was not planned. They just showed up at our door. So,
rogue heating engineers?
yeah, exactly.
Well, should we just sort of like carry on until the hour anyway, and
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah, so I was talking about metaphors, right? So I think metaphors are really like crucial and helpful when, yeah, when we don't have the words or the language to describe something, or we're trying to describe something we experienced or felt that is like hard to explain to another person. Metaphors can be really handy. But I think also it's partly in our, and again, speaking from like a very Western perspective, but I think it's also partly in like our training and our schooling. Like most of us are very bad at like coming up with a metaphor. I know I'm bad at it. Like I can't always do it on the fly. Sometimes I think of something and I'm like, oh, this feels like, you know, like this feels like floating on a river in the sun and, feeling the warm on the top and the cold on the bottom. Like that's what it feels like. Like that's a nice, and I don't know what I would be describing, but anyway. But like it's hard to come up with those on the fly. And I think that's also a skill we need to practice. Like
right,
to
right.
find the metaphors that fit other things because we have the kind of idiomatic ones that we all learn, but a lot of those are really kind of awful, like kill two birds with one stone. And you're like, ugh. So, yeah.
Yeah, feed. I've heard people saying like feed two birds with one loaf or something like that, or like, and actually you shouldn't give bread to birds. It's not good for their for their palate or how they digest, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
most birds anyway. Um, so further refinements. Uh,
Yeah.
if we can at least move from like death to giving life and then better quality of diet, that would be a good direction to
Yeah,
travel.
exactly.
Yeah, I hear you. So there's something around the ability to make metaphors, which is actually it's really nice that you highlight that because I've had a few not conversations with this card, but around this area of like ecolinguistics and shifting framing, and I'm not sure that's really come up so clearly before. So I'm really taking that on board of like actually practicing making metaphors is like an um amazing kind of meta skill. I think
Yeah.
actually help us learn. Because we do learn through metaphor, right? It's like how we create meaning, the relationship between the metaphor and what it's describing.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so if we kind of bring that to some of your work and I guess what we are both sort of engaged with around like bio leadership, the regenerative movement, there's okay, this wasn't scripted either. Clearly, um, it's Nell. We're going to try and have a call today.
Oh, nice.
Uh, I'll call her back. She's just started the Cards for Life course last
Yeah,
week,
I saw. That's great.
which is really nice. So I was going to say, like, we explore metaphors around. I wonder if there are any metaphors that come to you, or if we even leave open a challenge like that we could come back with of metaphors around describing liminal stories. And so, just to start off, like the metaphors I kind of know of, what's emerging? I like that question. What's emerging?
Yeah.
And stories from the edges. So I guess like one metaphor that Cards for Life would offer is margins, the margins card, where the image is like the edges of a field where there's wildflowers and as is a farming practice, allow the biodiversity to flourish at the edges. And then if there's a disruption to the kind of the mainstream, some of that diversity can come in and bring new life
Yeah.
to the center. So there's something around the liminal and the marginal. Um, and then, yeah, actually, I just kind of land on that as like a metaphor being like the margins of a field. And I wonder how useful or accessible that is to people. Um, yeah, I,
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think
yeah,
I think it is one of those things, I think like I was saying kind of like before we started recording, like finding these metaphors, I think requires us to go outside, and not everyone has spent time with that, and not everyone has access to it. And so I think this idea of like the margins, also like in the Cards for Life course I was in, when she was talking about what was her name? I'm blanking on her name now. She was talking about her going out with her husband and looking at the margins of their garden.
that's right, Stephanie. Yeah,
Stephanie. And they could do that because they had it there and it was an experience they could have. But I'm like not sure that metaphor would make sense to everybody. Someone who's grown up in a city and hasn't spent a lot of time in green space. So that's another thing I've been thinking of like,
yeah,
I think it's really important to try and find more organic metaphors, but also like if we're trying to help people to understand what's going on by using some of these metaphors, they need to still be accessible enough. So this is why, for example, things like dandelions are great because they're everywhere and it doesn't matter where you live.
yeah, yes.
You know what I mean? So this is another thing I'm thinking about. Like it's all of this with language. Also, I think part of my early journey with it has been kind of being, yeah, being told off is sort of the wrong word, but I kind of got some feedback from someone that a word I had used in a session was like a little bit inappropriate and offensive. And I was like, oh, wow, like I just hadn't thought of it before. And then she explained it to me, and we had a really good discussion around it. And it's just made me think like, oh, things need to be accessible. And also, you don't want to make people feel marginalized or shut out because they don't get it when
Mm.
you're trying to, yeah. So it's a really
Right.
complex, multi-layered thing.
It is. So you highlight for me a challenge of language, which is about universality versus like specificity. Like how relatable is the metaphor to a
Yeah.
particular audience? I guess it sort of it takes us back to the kind of like the communication strategy of like who are we trying to appeal to and recognizing that necessarily um not all metaphors are going to speak to all people all the time. And that might not even be our objective anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
I think sometimes probably mass appeal is the thing, and other times like relatability for a particular audience. But I really love what you're saying about the urban, well, in my words now, like the urban source domain of metaphors that are relatable to increasingly like urbanized world population, right? And it makes me come up with something that's just knotted my brain a little bit to go like, what's the city farm of metaphors? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So they're
Yeah.
like, if
Yeah, I
that
like
makes
that.
sense. As it's a bit, it sort of bites its own tail, but um, yeah. What's the nature, the life in civilization or like urban spaces that's relatable to people to help bring more life and more nature back into our lives and into the world, I guess. So, and I love
Yeah.
that you highlighted dandelion actually, because it's such an iconic image and the seeds being carried by there's almost the dandelion is almost a story already, isn't it?
Yeah.
And just wonderful how it grows everywhere and pops up
Everywhere.
everywhere. So
Everyone knows what it is, right? So,
right, and the
yeah.
Dandelion Fellowship that I know you're on, like when you said that, that's just it's got real spell power. I don't know
Yeah.
anything about the content of the course. I know the organization that's hosting it, but it's like Dandelion Fellowship.
Yeah.
It's maybe it's got lion in the word as well. That I don't know if it's nestled in there.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's like for me, that's been something I'm trying to unpack, especially when like the work that I want to do. I mean, I would love to work also for like communities and movements, but realistically, if I need to make money, I will probably have to work with businesses, because that will, at least at the start, probably pay the bills. So yeah, it's for me, I'm trying to find this balance of like also shifting the language of business, and how can we do that in a way that's accessible and doesn't feel, yeah, it doesn't make people feel like, well, no one's gonna know what that is.
Mm.
Like I used to work for a leadership school, and we all agreed at one point that leadership is like actually not a great word, but that we couldn't come up with another one.
Right. Or at least couldn't come up with an alternative that's still recognizable as
Yeah,
to
yeah,
to people.
exactly.
So this question of transformation with language is a really tricky one, isn't it? Um, what are the tactics for stretching us away from the words that we want to move beyond?
Yeah, and that's why I think when it comes to like branding and stuff, that's why images are so important, because
Right.
they can really help tell a story. So like I think the words matter a lot, but there is something about the combination of the two that, yeah, can be really powerful and really help people understand what you're trying to do, what you're trying to explain. Um, but yeah, I feel like every time I think about this topic, I just come up with more questions.
It's yeah, because it's so meta as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like he's saying like you use the metaphor or the concept unpack a moment ago, and then I don't know, I start paying attention to everything and thinking like, well, what alternative processes are there? Is it a case of unpacking or like and you know,
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah,
the
I mean, I
the
think it's like
ground,
unearthing maybe is a better one, better word. But yeah, it's like there's all of these ways, and I think the hardest thing is to catch yourself in how you speak and figure out the words that you tend to use yourself, because we like as we get to be adults, we speak so unconsciously a lot of the time. Like we just use words because they're the ones we know. And then sometimes you catch yourself being like, oh, I say that a lot. I should find a different way to say that. And so that's one of the hardest things to do, is to already find in your own language, like, oh, I really overuse that term. Or, you know, I tend to use this really like poor metaphor and I should find a better one, that kind of thing.
yeah. I really like that. Actually, that brings it back to the inner and the kind of the personal and stuff as well, right? Of like, if we want to see the change in language out there, then it really like, what are the changes that we're going to make on
Yeah.
an individual scale? I've noticed one little shift is from just commonly saying guys all the time, even when talking to people of any gender or groups of mixed gender or identification. And folks is kind of nice and soft
Yeah.
because folk, there are people, but even just saying people, okay, people, let's go.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
guys. And so that's like a little, I think all of these little adjustments really do add up to quite a lot. And I ask people, how are you being instead of how are you doing? And that's, I'm not saying
Yeah.
that's more correct. It's just a choice that shifts.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
and I try to, um, I guess, as an expression of values, I like the cards, for instance, I talk about they and give them an agency, which I do feel like where they want to go or how they want to travel and things like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
does that sort of enchants the world some more as well? And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's true. And I think that's one thing I will say I really appreciated about the kind of, yeah, not past tense, really appreciate about the kind of DEI movement, is they've really been good about pointing out language that we use that marginalizes, yeah, anyone who is not the dominant white male, basically, because our language was kind of built around that. Um, so things like, everyone uses the like, hey guys, and then that was like a big conversation I remember many years ago having in some of the companies I worked in. Um, so I think that's a really good place to start, to think about how they did it and see if we can extrapolate some of that actually to like more organic language when we're talking about the environments that we're in or the things that are happening in the world, because they were quite effective at explaining why some of these terms are harmful in certain ways.
yeah,
Um, so it just came to me, but that I think that's actually
that's
a great
great.
example to learn from.
So do you think there's a process there of like analysis or critique or filtering or even of just adoption of alternative terms that we could like
Yeah, I think some of it is indeed coming up with new language and starting to use it and see if it catches on. But I think some of it is really just getting people to notice what they say. Because I remember that with the whole conversation around the word guys as this catch-all term, that there were so many conversations that we were having where we spoke about it as colleagues, and then we would point at each other every time someone said it, and people were like, wow, we say this way more than we realized. And already that changes things, because you have to start by observing, right? You have to start by noticing the language you're using and again catching yourself using it. And it got to the point where I don't say that anymore, because I eventually caught myself before I would say it every time. And then now I just don't say it anymore. But I
yeah,
did for a long, long time. This is really interesting. I think that's awareness is a huge piece of it. It's just,
yeah. It feels really pragmatic, the points that you're sort of landing on, and one is our own personal language shift and being self-reflective, I guess, so that we become more choiceful about language. And then rather than sort of trying to fix language, or fix other people's language, um, actually the enabling thing is to just help people with a mirror, help people notice what
Yeah.
choices of words they're making, or to notice even that they do have a choice. And I think a lot of the time, maybe even what's seen as quite violent language or sort of death or dominating language, it's just quite unthinkingly, that's what people have always said. You're like, oh yeah, kill two birds with one stone. So what? Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah, exactly. Like I think like metaphors and idioms like that, we've been saying them since childhood. So like if someone says kill two birds with one stone, I know what they mean and I don't actually think about dead birds.
right,
Right, And so I'm so far removed from the words because I know what the metaphor stands for. And then it doesn't. Whereas, like, if you actually start to pay attention to it, then you start to get the aversion. Like, oh, that's actually not a nice thing to say. So I think observation and noticing, and especially if you can do it in community, like with your colleagues or friends, and the openness to point it out when other people do it as not as like a shaming thing or a judgment thing, but just a, hey, I caught you say that. And the person's like, oh, you know, and they have that moment of like, crap, I did it again. But then it's not a judgment thing. It's not telling them they're bad. It's just like we all agree we're going to point it out when we do it. And then it really helps you to start to catch yourself. And you have to be able to catch yourself before you say the words. Otherwise, you can't change it. And that is a process. That is like you have to work backwards and just takes
right,
time.
right. That's an unlearning process. So the noticing is going to feel uncomfortable until you start to replace with something you feel like happy with.
Yeah, and I think the noticing is uncomfortable at first, and then it's kind of funny. And then that's when you actually can make that shift into something else where you start catching yourself and like, oh man, I did it again. And then you kind of laugh at yourself and you're like, okay, next time I'm going to catch myself before the words come out of my mouth. And then eventually you do, and you can make a choice to say something different.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And that feels like such a good recommendation and like a suggestion to any groups or teams that actually want to shift their language to make a kind of a collective game of that, really.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually fun if you can all do it together. It doesn't have to feel like a, yeah, you're being punished for saying the wrong thing. Like it doesn't have to be that way.
Right, right. And that contracts us so much. We've got to get through that sort of defensiveness around getting it wrong or right. And I think language is so slippery as well, and it's shifting all the time that maybe there's some ideas around perfection that by changing language, we're forced to kind of let go a little bit too tight a grip on sort of the right word because context change and audiences change and
Yeah, and I think especially when you're talking about things around climate or the planet, that's changing super fast right now. Like sustainability used to be a great word, and now people are like, it's not enough.
yes,
Like
almost becoming
that
a
took only 10 years. That happened so fast.
in regenerative circles, sustainability is like the S word, it's like
Yeah,
the word.
exactly. So it's like it does, I think that does help actually, just to know like, oh, this may disappear in a year and a different word may take its place, and that's okay. We're all learning as we go.
Mm.
Yeah.
We are all learning as we go. And actually, as you talk about the impermanence of language, I just bring it back to the image on the card, which is a rare image from one of my travels. And that was in the north of Norway. I saw the impression that a crow left on the snow when it landed,
Amazing.
the wings and tail. And I was sort of looking for like an image of animal tracks in the earth or something that kind of like had a sense of kind of primordial language, impressions. But I think it's the fact that it's kind of in the snow that like that that sort of pictogram is just going to melt away.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly.
it's all a process too, rather than, perfect collection. But yeah, I think we can work on it together and help each other notice. And like, I'd love to, if we fold this conversation here for now,
Yeah.
I'd love to pick it up again, actually, because there's still something around liminality and stories and what's emerging
Yeah, definitely.
that feels really valuable. And I just highlighting again, I think you've really helped me in this conversation. Just bring it back to what we can do, which is our personal language choice, and then the next sphere of influence with those around us. Um, because it gets very difficult feeling like how what are the right words, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I think, and I don't think we'll know. I think that's also part of this whole liminal space. Like, we don't even know what the next story is. We have some ideas of a direction, and we have a very clear idea of the direction we don't want to be walking in anymore. But like, there's still a lot of possibility there. So I'm not sure we're going to know what the words are. So being playful with it and allowing ourselves to try stuff and then be like, ah, no, that's not right. That's okay. Throw that one out. Let's try a different one. Like, yeah, that's also okay. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sweet. Well, that's a beautiful place to let it rest, I think, is like on the liminal.
yeah,
And what's liminal is all that's going to be a shifting edge. So let's play there and excited to see how you can support people to kind of play there on those liminal stories as well.
yeah. Thanks. Me too.
Cool. Thanks for joining, Christina.
Yeah, yeah. It was lovely. It was a fun conversation.